Let's explore how logs are rotated within Red Hat Enterprise Linux. We'll create a subsection, labeling it log rotation, subsection of syslog because we constantly refer to syslog items that are rotated. And the features include rotation of logs based on criteria. And criteria may include, for example, size, age of the log, amongst other things. In addition, log rotation provides the ability to compress logs. As well as to maintain logs for a defined period, such as a few weeks, a couple months, or even a couple years, depending on your log retention policy. And when you use log rotation, you should in fact ensure that the rotation mechanism is in line with your log rotation policy, your corporate log rotation policy, as it is important that it is defined, and if it isn't defined, define a log rotation policy that is in line with your log retention policy in the event that you're ever audited by a client or a third-party institution regarding historical logs for different systems. Now, most of the logs that filter through the Linux box are handled by syslog, but some logs, such as the Apache logs or Samba logs, are handled by those applications, Apache and Samba respectively. Nonetheless, so long as you point log rotation software or Logrotate to the appropriate directory where the files are located, using wildcards, the Logrotate software will find the files and rotate them based on your criteria. Let's identify the package which represents Logrotate, and we'll do so on the remote system. That's fine. It's the later edition of Enterprise 5 anyway. We'll RPM query all grep Logrotate, and the version of Logrotate will be returned momentarily. Major version 3, which is the same version found on Enterprise 5.0. Let's go ahead and query all grep on the local system. And you'll see that it's also major version 3.7, minor version 4.7. So both versions are identical, despite the fact that the Enterprise version is off by 0.1 in one instance. So let's enumerate the contents of the package using RPM query list logrotate. And when you interrogate RPM packages, you don't need to specify the numeric portion. Generally, the unique portion, which is the alpha section, is all that's required to enumerate the package. Now, sometimes a numeric may be a portion of the main name or the alpha section, so you may need to at that point specify an alpha numeric, but generally it's just the alpha section, such as logrotate. As you can see, logrotate provides a whopping number of files. In cron.daily, there's an entry for logrotate, which we briefly looked at, which is where logrotate is executed from on a daily basis. There's a primary configuration file in etc, which we'll be looking at in a second. And there's a logrotate.d directory where you may place entries for additional programs to be rotated. So let's just identify some of the key files. Primary config file and the logrotate.d directory for logs to be rotated, and you place beneath that directory one file per log type that you'd like to have rotated based on criteria. The primary program is beneath user sbin. Programs that are beneath sbin of any form, whether beneath /sbin or user sbin, tend to be executable only by the root user. And then there's documentation, as well as a file which is maintained beneath varlib to contain statistical information regarding Logrotate's previous executions, similar to Webalizer's varlib Webalizer entries, which keeps track of its stats so it knows what it's done and can pick up where it left off. Without this file, logrotate.status, Logrotate would have no idea as to what it has recently done, or it wouldn't be able to keep track of the items that it has rotated, and consequently rotate the entries that are, or the files that are to be rotated each and every time. It's smart enough via logrotate.status, logrotate that is, to pick up where it left off. So for example, if it's rotated 5 of the 10 files for today, when it runs a second time, it will only attempt to rotate the remaining 5 and not the original 5, unless you override using the -F option to force logrotate to rotate all 10 files, supposing of course you have 10 files to rotate. With that said, let's examine the contents of the primary configuration file, logrotate.conf. We'll use the less pager. And what you'll see are some defaults that apply unless you override them on a per log file basis. So for example, by default, log files are to be rotated weekly. And this is a global configuration file. We should just note that. Primary global configuration file for all logs. We should also note that the entries in this file can be overridden that is, by context-sensitive files, i.e., a file for Apache with its directives would override similar directives in the global configuration file, such as the interval at which the file is to be rotated. The default global setting is weekly. However, you could rotate daily, weekly, monthly, and so on. How many backlogs to keep? If we're rotating weekly, this means we'll keep 4. So we should be able to go back 4 weeks into the past and find logs. A new file will be created, a new log file, as opposed to reusing the old file. Compression is turned off by default, but may be turned on a per log basis or on a global basis. Compression is ideal for systems that are very busy creating large log files. Additionally, any item found beneath etc logrotate.d, as mentioned, will be included in the overall configuration. So individual files, let's say for Apache Samba and so on, will be included in the main configuration read by logrotate. So when logrotate is called and it reads etc logrotate.conf, it includes any items found beneath etc logrotate.d. Here we see a block defined for the file which maintains logon attempts, varlog wtmp, with directives that override the global settings regarding when the file is to be rotated, the creation settings, and how many times or how many backlogs are to be kept. So for varlog wtmp, it's rotated only monthly, or every month. It's created with the permissions 664, which means read, write, read. It's owned by root and the group UTMP. So you can assign permissions using the create directives or create directive in a logrotate entry. Instead of rotating for 4 weeks, it's rotated for 1 week. You may also include other log entries here, but the suggested way to configure other log entries, like for the Cisco file that we've created, is to create a distinct file and deposit it in etc logrotate.d. So this file is very straightforward. And again, no need to memorize the settings that are applicable, the directives. Simply run man logrotate.conf from the configuration prompt or from the shell prompt, and it will return all of the applicable directives. So man logrotate will return the entries that are permitted. And we see that the man page is included, so that's man logrotate directly as opposed to man logrotate conf, as we saw what was enumerated from the RPM file. And this returns the directives that are supported, how to run it, including the force option we've mentioned, and an optional configuration file. Optional meaning it will use etc logrotate.conf. Verbosity, debug mode, whether or not you want to mail the status of the log rotation, and below you'll see settings for setting up your files. So for var log messages, here's an example to rotate it with backlogs going back 5 weeks, weekly, and after the file has been rotated, a hang-up signal or a restart signal is sent to syslog so it can start logging in the new file. Here's a sample access log for Apache, sample for news, so on and so forth. If you keep scrolling through this man page, however, you'll see the additional directives such as compress, which uses gzip by default, which is a great option for large files, especially for firewall and other busy log files like web server files. And since most of the log files tend to be text anyway, you'll achieve or realize a large ratio of compression, which will reduce considerably your log file. And here's some other directives. Make a copy of the log file, but don't change the original, so you can copy it at a point in time and then rotate it based on that copy. You can copy and truncate, which truncates the original log file after creating a copy. And if you copy truncate, then there's no need to send a hang-up signal to your daemon, as the daemon will continue to use the truncated file. Truncated means zero it out, blank the file. We saw the create directive in use. You can indicate optionally a mode, such as 644 or 664 or 600 or anything that's applicable, with an optional owner and group to be assigned to the file. You may rotate daily if you'd like. You may add a date suffix to the old version of the log file. If empty, it'll rotate it anyway. There's also not if empty, so if the file is empty, it will not rotate it. We saw the usage of the include directive, where it includes items from logrotate.d, but you can include items from any directory that you'd like. We see an optional mail feature, which will mail the item that is to be rotated out of existence. So if you're maintaining 4 weekly backups, for example, of a log file, the 5th item, or on the 5th instance, the log file will be mailed to a recipient of your choice. There are options for mailing first and last, maximum age, and other sensible directives. If the log file is missing, then go on to the next one, don't complain. A log file could be missing, for example, if there's no log data. For example, syslog doesn't create the log file unless it receives information for it. So it's quite possible that a log file may be missing if there's no activity. No compression will not compress it. No copy truncate, no copy, no create, and other sensible settings that help you to tailor your environment. We discussed briefly the post-rotate option, where you are able to execute a series of commands, one or more, after a log file has been executed or rotated. You may also rotate before, or you may also execute a script before the rotation using the pre-rotate directive. So just like with a Kickstart installation of Red Hat Enterprise, if you need to execute a process prior to rotation, use pre-rotate. After rotation, use post-rotate. Some programs like syslog need to be sent a hang-up signal or reloaded or restarted in order to continue logging to the new file. Otherwise, they'll continue to log to the inode represented by the original file. You see a counter for rotate, how many you should rotate. There's even a directive here which you can set your criteria to based on size. So for example, if size is 100K, the file gets rotated. If it's 100 megabytes, it gets rotated a gigabyte. So not only can you rotate based on time, such as weekly, daily, or monthly, you may also rotate based on size, because again, some log files grow so rapidly that indeed you need to rotate based on a size-based criteria as opposed to a time-based criteria. So we've already mentioned you can rotate based on size, as well as the age, which is a time-based item, and the age is usually daily, weekly, as well as monthly, and monthly will cover any extended amount of period for rotation. And we saw that with the WTMP file. It's rotated on a monthly basis, so if we take a look at that log file, we should see no items, at least on the new server, and perhaps a few items on the older server, like CBT Server 1. For example, let's take a look in var log. The files are rotated exactly where the original files are. Notice for WTMP, let's LSL it, WTMP star, that there exists only one entry, one rotated entry, that is, WTMP.1. And again, the rule for this file, if we just take a brief look at logrotate.conf, is specified right here, and it's rotated monthly. It's created with 664. Let's confirm the permissions as root UTMP, and it's rotated only once. So as we can see, 664, it's created only once, and when it comes time in a month to rotate the existing WTMP file, the old file will be overwritten and will be removed from the system as a result, unless of course we mail it to someone. So it's created with the right permissions, right ownership, root UTMP, and it has a suffix of .1 to indicate that it is a first rotated item. And that's the default behavior of Logrotate, to add a suffix of .1. But you can alter the suffix using date extension or compression and other options. So the files that are rotated are located in var log. Let's take a look at boot log, for example. The current version is boot.log. The rotated versions include 1, 2, 3, and 4 going back to September of 2007. So here we see rotation, but we didn't see the rules in the main configuration file for boot.log. We also see rotation for secure, so let's LSL secure star. Secure has very little data, all of the files that is. The primary file is this one. The rotated entries go back to November 19th, and so on. Now let's dig a little deeper into the etc logrotate.d directory. We'll navigate to that directory on both systems. On the local server, we see various entries for different programs. As mentioned, there's an entry for Apache. Let's take a look at it since it's a common service, and it includes a typical rule block. This is a standard rule block. The location to the file, which may or may not include wildcards, followed by an open curly brace, any number of logrotate directives, followed by a closed curly brace. So let's copy this Apache block and describe each of the items briefly. So this is the HTTPD entry for Apache, used to rotate Apache logs. And here we find the contents. We've pasted the contents of the file. So when you set up a logrotate rule, you indicate one or more files, which may or may not include wildcards. In this case, Logrotate will search varlog HTTPD, and on other distributions of Linux, perhaps varlog Apache 2, in search of files that terminate with LOG. So let's take a brief look at varlog HTTPD. And in this directory, we currently see nothing because Apache's never been started. If it's missing, that's okay, because we're not running a web server on this system. It will not rotate it if it's empty, and there are shared scripts that are to be used. The post-rotate script, which will restart or send a hang-up signal to the Apache process. Here we see a kill hang-up signal being sent to a bash extraction of the process ID for Apache that's running at any given time, and it, as a result, will send a restart and restart the Apache instance, which will cause it to log to new entries. But nothing's being logged because Apache isn't running. Now this is just to give you a sense for how you would lay out log rotation in any event. On the remote system, let's navigate into etc logrotate.d. We're going to see similar entries here, such as min-getty, that's a min-getty process, ACPID, syslog. Syslog is of interest because it handles logging from many of the daemons. So a brief look at syslog on a remote system reveals what exactly happens with the syslog entry. The syslog entry rotates several files. the main varlog messages, which is a catch-all log file, the security file for the auth-priv facility, the mail log file, regardless of your mailing daemon, so it could be postfix, qmail, or sendmail, or exim, or any other mailer that supports the mail facility, the spooler, which is used for cups for printing, the boot log, and the cron log. These are all entries that get rotated as a result of the syslog entry. All of these items share the following post-rotate script, and that is, after the rotation of all of these log files, then and only then will a hang-up signal be sent to the syslog process. And again, we see bash extraction using backticks to ascertain the PID of the running syslog instance. In fact, if we copy this and run it from the shell, you'll see that the PID for syslog is returned, and if we psef grep 6395, you'll see that indeed it's syslog. So that is how Logrotate is able to tell what process ID syslog currently is running as, and is able to send a hang-up signal to that process ID after it has rotated all of these log files. Now, if you set up a new logging entry, let's say as we have done for the Cisco router, using syslog, and you need to have that item rotated, then you should place it within the syslog file, as opposed to creating a separate entry, since the log file is handled by syslog. So our task, as usual, is to set up rotation rule for Cisco log. Now, our Cisco log file is very small, so perhaps we should rotate it based on size as opposed to age. Let's take a brief look at varlog cisco-router.log. In fact, we'll copy this path as we'll need it when we modify the syslog logrotate entry. As you can see, it's only 428 bytes, so it really contains nothing. So we need to set criteria based on a very small size to rotate it. And again, as mentioned, if you man logrotate, you'll see the size-related directive, which allows you to indicate log rotation based on size. Here we see size equals 100K, but in our case, the file's not even 100K. So what you'll do is find the size directive, and the directives are arranged alphabetically. So navigate on down to size to see how it can be used. Now notice, according to the documentation, if size or the number after size is followed by K or M, then it's interpreted as kilobytes or megabytes. Otherwise, the interpretation is simply bytes. So we can set our rotation, let's say, based on 100 bytes by indicating simply size 100. Let's go ahead and update our configuration. We'll nano syslog and simply append before the curly braces the path to the Cisco router file. Also ensure that everything is accessible, because on one line, as nano tends to wrap it, and this will cause the Cisco router file to be rotated just the way the other files will be rotated based on global settings. But there's a catch here. The Cisco log file should have its own set of settings. So with that said, let's copy this entire entry, or save it as a totally different document, that is. So we'll Control-O, or copy it. We'll copy syslog, because we've thrown in a curveball at the last section, which is we want the file to be rotated based on a very small size, as opposed to the other rules that apply to the other files. Again, the current syslog file will rotate based on the rules, the directives defined in the etclogrotate.conf file. We know that because syslog doesn't define directives for the amount of times to rotate and the other criteria-related information. So let's copy syslog to Cisco, then modify Cisco, and then we'll remove the other log entries and define some special entries for the Cisco router file. And here we have the whole block, which was inadvertently pasted in, so we'll go ahead and just remove it using Control-K, and then we'll copy the path to the file manually. and this is the full path. We'll paste it. Now, as far as shared scripts, there's only one router file or one file being rotated, so we don't need to indicate shared scripts. We can comment this out. But we do need a post-rotation script to execute, and that is the restart or the hang-up signal to be sent to the syslog instance. We also need to define criteria. Again, the syslog related files are going to inherit settings from etc logrotate.conf because they're not defined within the syslog file. So settings such as frequency, weekly, how many to rotate, so 4 or whatever number makes sense, the fact that a new item should be created, will all be derived from the main file. So we need to define all of that in our file. So we want to rotate, let's save it for 52 rotations, or if we're going to rotate based on size, maybe even more. But let's suppose we'll only reach 100 bytes after a full week, so we'll have 52 or 1 per week. So we rotate for 52 times. We want to create a new file. And if there are optional directives or permissions that you'd like to set, go ahead and do so. We'd like the file to be compressed. It wouldn't hurt to have a date extension. So let's go ahead and indicate date extension. But we still have yet to set the size directive, setting it to a certain number of bytes. Size 100. Now don't set both size as well as age. Use one or the other in your criteria so that the Logrotate software knows exactly what to do for the log file. You don't want it to be confused between age and size, because the current log file may not have reached a certain size, but may have reached a certain age, and vice versa. We need to give the software clear directives for rotation. So again, we're going to rotate 52 times. We'll create a new file. And again, if you need specific permissions, one place to start is by looking at the existing file. As you can see, it's owned by root. So this would be an option to apply. Let's go ahead and just indicate for create that it's to be owned by root and root, and optionally with permission 600. So 0600 root. This means root will own it, and there will be 600 permissions so that other users cannot see the file. And it gets rotated based on size 100. Date extension is also applied. And again, if there are any questions regarding any of the directives, execute the man page for Logrotate, navigate to the section where the directives are returned, and they are presented alphabetically, so simply find it. Let's scroll down, and momentarily you'll see the date extension, date ext, which will tack on quad year, dual month, dual date as a suffix. You may also indicate an extension of your choice. Log files with ext can keep it after the rotation is used. So if you wanted to, you could tack on an additional extension, which will cause your file to not be rotated out of existence. With that said, let's save the changes to the Cisco file and just confirm that it exists, and it does. So now we can execute log rotation similar to the way it's executed daily. If we navigate to etc cron.daily and take a look at the existing settings for Logrotate, you'll see that when it executes, this is the main command line, Logrotate followed by the path to the log file. So we can execute it similarly, which is again Logrotate, which is in our path, etc logrotate.conf. This will execute and update its status file, and if any of the files have met the criteria defined in any of the files in logrotate.d as well as the primary configuration file, they'll be rotated as well. But sometimes, based on the status file, the entries do not get rotated unless you force a rotation because they were recently rotated. So that's something else to bear in mind if you don't see any updated results in your log files. Now let's take a look at our varlog directory. There we see the file has been rotated. It still has its prefix of cisco-router.log, Now it has a date extension followed by the GZ suffix and its 265 bytes. The new file is available as a 0-byte file. If we execute a file against Cisco star, we see one's compressed, the other is an empty file. And we can always zcat the compressed version of the file to examine the contents, and you'll see what entries are there. So with that said, the rotation worked, but again, sometimes you need to rotate with a forceful rotation. So we created an entry, just to recap, create entry in etc logrotate.d based on etc logrotate.d syslog. So we created that entry, we modified the entry to rotate based on new criteria. Then we executed or re-rotated using logrotate and the path to the primary logrotate configuration file. Sometimes, however, you may need to force the rotation. So force using -f.conf. And now every time logrotate runs on a daily basis, if the Cisco log file meets the criteria, it will rotate it. Now generally, for a router configuration log file, the rotation is based more on age and less on size. But again, it depends on your environment. If it is to be based on age, then update your criteria, that's nano Cisco, so that it's based on age as opposed to size, by inserting a directive such as daily. This will rotate the file daily whenever logrotate runs, and will rotate it for 52 days. If you want to keep, let's say, a year's worth of files, then indicate something like 365. And every day the file will be rotated and compressed with a date extension, and you'll have it for a year. And you could even use the Cisco entry for additional infrastructure devices. If the criteria is identical, then just append the other log files, such as log 2, log 3, log 4, with the absolute path, of course. So that's a little bit about how Logrotate software works. We're going to move on to some other useful utilities that will help you to be proficient within a Linux environment.